Hello, everyone. Welcome to Understanding Editors, a publishing panel offered by the University Press of Florida as part of our Fall 2025 Publishing Symposium. My name is Emily Hunsaker, and I'm an editorial assistant at the Press, and I'll be facilitating this session. This panel brings together speakers representing the types of editors that authors may collaborate with when publishing a book. You'll be hearing from an acquisitions editor, a series editor, a developmental editor, a project editor, and a copy editor. We hope that you will come away from this panel with a good understanding of each editor's role in the publication process, how they work with authors, and how they strengthen book projects. I will now introduce our panelists. First, we'll have Stephanye Hunter. She's editor-in-chief in the acquisitions department at the University Press of Florida. Next, we have Joel Correia, an assistant professor in the Department of Human Dimensions of Natural Resources at Colorado State University and series co-editor for the Critical Geographies of Latin America and Caribbean series at the University of Florida Press. Rachel Hynson is a developmental editor and founder of Et al. Scholars. Martha Walters is a project editor and manager of the editorial design and production department at the University Press of Florida. And Billy Smith Haffner is a freelance copy editor with 11 years of experience in university press publishing. They have a master's degree in publishing from Pace University and are based in Southwest Colorado. And now, a few pointers and guidelines for this panel. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel, Florida Press. After the webinar, registrants will receive an email with a link to the recording. Closed captioning has been enabled. To view the closed captioning, please click on the closed caption button in your meeting controls. Please submit questions for the panelists through the Q&A throughout the presentation, and we will address questions at the end as time allows. We will share contact information for our panelists at the end of the presentation, and we hope you'll reach out to them with any questions you may have. I will now turn it over to our panelists to talk about their roles in the publication process, beginning with Stephanye Hunter.
Thank you, Emily. All right, so everyone, you should see the life cycle of the book on your screen. We're going to leave this up during our presentation so that you can follow along in the process. So I'm Stephanye Hunter. I'm an acquisitions editor, and I'm on the staff at the Press. I oversee projects during that top row of the life cycle of the book, from submission to transmittal to editing. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I work with book projects during each stage. So each acquisitions editor at the Press is responsible for enlisting projects in select subject areas. My current subject areas are Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Modernist Literature, Dance, Florida Creative Nonfiction, and Gardening. And you can find each acquisitions editor's areas on our website. Acquisitions editors do a lot of outreach on behalf of the Press. I attend conferences, I stay up to date on publications, I do a lot of research, and I reach out to prospective authors about their work. Prospective authors also submit book ideas to me for consideration. I review all of the submissions in my subject areas, and I invite proposals for projects that I think might be a good fit for the Press. I read proposals carefully. Sometimes I give feedback, sometimes I ask questions, and ultimately I decide which projects the Press considers for publication. As an acquisitions editor, I also manage book series. A book series is going to be focused on a specific topic within a subject area. For example, I acquire in modernist literature, and one of the series that I manage is a series on the writer James Joyce. If I think that a project is a good fit for a series, I'll share that book proposal with the series editors for their consideration as well. Some of my books are published in series, but not all of them are. And we're going to be hearing from a series editor in a little bit to talk more about that. So once an author and I have agreed that the Press is a good fit for their book, I work with the author as they develop and write their manuscript. This collaboration can take a couple different forms. Sometimes authors just reach out to me if they have a question. Other times I might read a draft of a chapter that they might be struggling with. If an author needs additional support in writing, editing, or revising their manuscript, I might recommend they work with a developmental editor. And we're going to be hearing from a developmental editor in a little bit. So when the manuscript is complete, I send the project out to external peer reviewers for feedback. If the project is in a book series, I'll send the manuscript to the series editor as well. I select the peer reviews and coordinate the peer review process. When I've received all of the reviews, I share them with the author. And at that point, the author and I discuss the plan for revision and the next steps. Sometimes the revised manuscript needs another round of peer review. So if it does, I'll coordinate that as well. When the book project has received sufficiently positive peer reviews, I present it to our faculty editorial board for final publication approval. Once the board has approved a project, I work with the author to negotiate the contract terms. I draw up the contract and send it to the author for their review, and I answer any questions that they may have. So I did want to note that a few projects do go under advanced contract earlier in the process, often at the proposal, just after the proposal stage. So in those instances, I'll work with an author on the contract negotiations earlier in the process. The final step, after a project has been approved by the editorial board, I work with the author to submit the final manuscript, any images, and the necessary permissions. I review these final documents, check all of their revisions. I check that we have everything we need, and I check that the documents are formatted correctly. And then I transmit the project to our editorial department, and that's symbolized by the launch rocket ship on the life cycle of the book. I think I can hand it back to you, Emily.
Awesome, thank you. Sorry, I was having trouble with my video. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And next, I'd like to welcome Joel Correia.
Hello, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Stephanie and Emily, and thanks for coordinating and for everybody's time for showing up. It looks like we have a good number of participants out there, so it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to share some perspective with you all. And I say that as well, having also been an author of a book. And so like thinking about like demystifying the process a bit, I think is really helpful and important. And so I appreciate this this effort by the University of Florida Press to open up this kind of informational pathway for folks. I'm a series editor or co-editor in the it's the Critical Geographies of Latin America and the Caribbean series, and I'm really fortunate to share the editorship with several other key collaborators, including Adam Bledsoe, Andrea Marston, Aaron Strain, and Joaquin Villanueva. And together we really work as a collective of editors, and I want to bring that to the fore because it's perhaps a bit specific to the process and my experience that I will talk about. And what I'm going to really focus on is the first kind of phase or first facet and the green phase, if you will, even like the preliminary parts of the green phase of the acquisitions in the life cycle of a book that is shown here on the screen. And the reason is because our series is relatively new. I think we launched it officially about a year and a half ago, though creating the series actually took several years. So finding the series editors coming together around a shared vision and identifying what that vision would be, and then eventually launching that for the acquisition of books, took quite some time and a lot of intention and goodwill and effort, and a lot of help by Stephanie as well. So thank you again, Stephanie, for that. And the reason why I also want to say that is because some of my comments will be quite specific to working with a book series rather than a general submission to an academic press. So the book I published was more of a general submission, whereas in our book series, Critical Geographies of Latin America and the Caribbean, we're really looking for books that engage that core theme in a very specific and delineated set of themes as described in the series description. So I would just say and start by saying that for potential authors, writing a book and working with series editors in a series can be a really helpful way to make your work very visible within a sub-discipline or within a key set of debates and areas. If that's what you're willing, if you're interested in doing, it can be a great pathway to think with. And that being said, we having been around for about 1.5 years now with this series, maybe 2 years, we have received several proposals, actually quite a lot of proposals. It's really exciting, and have worked with a lot of different authors at different phases in the process. So I want to talk about that a bit. Given that we have a collective of series editors, not just one or two, but we have 5 of us, we actually work really closely and carefully with Stephanye and with one another to really think about, with great intention, the different kinds of projects that we're bringing in to the series, and how they fit together in conversation, but also how they map out and meet a broader kind of goal and objective, which isn't like strictly defined, and it is quite open. But nevertheless, we want these books that are coming into the series to be kind of to contribute something within this broader kind of theme, right? And so that being said, we think about like what works we have already kind of invited into the series and what works are on the horizon potentially, and work very carefully with authors to think about what that might look like and how their works might contribute to that. And this really shapes, I think, the approach that we do in the series itself. And so you might be asking, well, how do we actually get books into the series, and how does one approach the series with a book proposal? We get a lot of wonderful book proposals, and sometimes it's just a matter of fit, like as in like closer alignment with the core themes and goals of the series. And so we can't always accept all proposals, of course, into the series, and it's not necessarily a critique of the work itself, but actually just a question of alignment and also the capacity of series editors, because we all kind of shepherd one project at a time, or well, we shepherd specific works, I should say, and we are juggling multiple projects at a time, but also have a limited capability to take on so many. So that kind of helps us think through what we're able to do and strategically move the series forward. We get book proposals in a lot of different ways. One is through conferences. So we are all quite active in going to conferences and talking with potential authors and sharing ideas about the series at those conferences with authors and meeting with them and talking. We circulate information about the series through listservs, and of course it exists on the University of Florida Press website. But then we also receive a lot of inquiries through direct emails and also word of mouth. So colleagues will have heard about the series and then share with other colleagues and friends. And then those folks generally reach out directly. And we start usually with fairly casual conversations about what it might look like to be part of the series. And then each of the series editors works carefully with an author to develop a bit of the idea and the proposal. And then we bring that to Stephanye. And in a series editors collective meeting, we discuss very carefully all of the proposals, look at their merits, and think about the ways in which they fit together. And then we collectively evaluate which proposals to invite into like a full submission in that process. And that would bring us into like the submission of the manuscript. And then often at that point, we kind of pass it off to Stephanye to work directly with the authors as far as like contract negotiations and things like that. But each series editor also has different ways in which they work with authors, because some of our authors are quite new in the career and some of them are more established in the career, and every author has a different kind of set of interests as far as what they're looking for. Some really want a hands-off approach, and so we're able to kind of facilitate the process in that way, providing guidance and insight about the work, but also just facilitating the peer review process and being involved in peer review process as well. And other authors are more interested in more guidance as they might be navigating their first book project. So I've had the privilege of being able to work really closely with some newer authors or people who are working on their first book to help them think really carefully about how you write a book, how we bring that together, and how to emphasize some of the themes in their books that might resonate really carefully with the audiences who are seeking to cultivate within this series and the books that we're publishing. And so we're looking for works that are engaging with critical geographic perspectives, but we're also not distinctly disciplinary in that regard. So we've worked with political scientists and anthropologists and historians who have all submitted proposals to the series, some of which have projects that are being under peer review and being developed fully and have been invited for full submission. And so it's really exciting to see this interdisciplinary conversation as well. And I think that a key insight for potential authors would then be to think about like the goal and aim of the series or the press that you are submitting your work for, and ensure that your work aligns very carefully with that, and be clear about the distinction, like the distinction of your work and what makes it new and kind of interesting within that. So I'd be happy to answer more questions in the chat, and just want to thank you all for your time and attention today. It's an honor to be able to share some perspective with you, and hope to see some proposals from you coming across our desk in the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joel. Next up, I'd like to welcome Rachel.
Hi all. Thanks so much for being here, whether live or later via the recording. Thanks to Stephanie for organizing this panel, the University Press of Florida for sponsoring it, and my fellow panelists and our facilitator for your labor and insights. As Emily said, I'm Rachel Hynson, founder and owner of Et al. Scholars, and I currently work and live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in the US. So my comments are going to be divided into three parts. What is developmental editing? How I personally got into developmental editing, and then also talking about when and how to work with a developmental editor, specifically for academics. So in terms of what is developmental editing, it's not what we typically think of when we hear the word editing. You would think at the very least when you hire an editor that they would return your writing to you with corrections or suggestions throughout. The feared red pen track changes markings, right? But technically, a developmental edit on your manuscript doesn't necessarily involve in-text edits. The main feedback that you'll get from a developmental editor will be an editorial letter or a document suggesting manuscript revisions. Now, this letter may certainly be accompanied by your lightly edited manuscript, but that depends on how interventionist your developmental editor is, and your agreed upon goals together as client and editor. And so, because I'm a developmental editor for academics, and that's also the focus of this panel, my examples will be around academic documents, but there are certainly developmental editors out there for other types of authors, so FYI. So I specifically work with scholars in the humanities and qualitative social sciences. And what that means is that I work with scholars whose methodology is qualitative, right? I work with scholars who are not doing quantitative work, right? And so my training as a historian is what prepares me to assess these types of manuscripts. I provide developmental editing for book proposals and book manuscripts, so we're very much on that top green line of the image on your screen, as well as manuscripts that are going to be published in academic journals or edited volumes. And then I also do mini developmental edits on academic job application documents and documents for tenure and promotion. So I'm very much immersed in the world of academic publishing or tenure and promotion. So I'm going to briefly outline my process for doing a developmental edit. And in this case, I'll use a book manuscript as an example, one that the author perhaps anticipates submitting to the University Press of Florida, for example. So I start by sitting down after the contract has been signed. I start by sitting down with the book manuscript itself, as well as a questionnaire that the author has filled out in advance about their goals and concerns. And then I do an initial read through to identify the topic, the scope, and the argument of the piece, which may or may not be clear at this point. And I also focus on organization. I ask myself, does the way the author is presenting the information make sense for the evidence they have and the argument they're advancing? And I will say, perhaps unsurprising, many authors do come to me for help identifying their argument. That's really normal. So Laura Portwood Stacer, the founder of Manuscript Works, identifies 4 pillars to a developmental edit for academics. The first pillar, argument and contribution. I want to know what argument is supported by the author's evidence and what the author's contribution to the broader literature is. The second pillar is evidence and analysis. This pillar requires that I assess how authors are using their evidence. What evidence are you using in support of your perhaps in progress argument? And the third pillar of 4 is structure and narrative. I assess how authors are presenting their information, and if their structure supports readers to understand and follow the evidence they're introducing in support of their argument. And I will add that as an autistic developmental editor, this area of developmental editing is really where I thrive, as I'm a bottom-up thinker, and I'm able to quickly identify patterns and inconsistencies in the narrative. And then the fourth pillar is style and voice. And this pillar I assess when authors are quoting other scholarship. I really want to ensure they're making the connection in their own words between their work and others' work. And so I'm happy to expand upon this process in the Q&A if you have any questions. I'm going to transition into talking briefly about how I got into developmental editing. I hold a PhD in Latin American history from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I started doing line editing for friends and colleagues shortly after graduating. But I really wasn't introduced to developmental editing until I hired a developmental editor to support me with my own book, which I published in 2019. And for that, I worked with Margie Thomas, founder of Scholarship, and I also learned a lot from the learning modules that Margie offers. Eventually, I learned how to write an editorial letter, and I took Laura Portwood Stacer's self-guided course on becoming a developmental editor for academics, which I would highly recommend if that's something you're interested in. And then I've been a full-time editor, not just part-time, but which I was before, but a full-time editor at All Scholars since 2023. So thinking about you in this process. So when and how to work with a developmental editor, right? And again, we're looking very much at that green top line of the image on your screen. I can help you with a proposal, right? I can help you submit a manuscript. I can help you respond to peer review comments, right? So we're very much at the top. So if you think a developmental editor might be able to support you with a project, many of us offer free consults to discuss our process or answer any questions you have. You can also just email us and ask us for a quote if you're not someone that likes to do the face-to-face chat. You might work with a developmental editor early on in your writing process when your project is still messy and uncomfortable and you think everyone will judge you for not having it clear in your mind. That's where we sort of step in. That's one place. You can also work with a developmental editor after you've received your reader reports back from the journal or the press, when peer reviewers in your field have commented on the project and given their recommendations for improvement, which Stephanye elaborated on earlier. And then I'm going to end by saying that working with an editor, including a developmental editor, is a humbling process, right? You're confronted with memories of all the people in your past who've given you unkind or perhaps unjustified feedback on your writing, and you might worry that we're going to judge you. And so know that in my work, at least, I lead with gentleness followed by honesty. I'll celebrate what you're doing at the same time as I'm going to kindly recommend and be honest with you about recommended fixes and changes. And this is where a consult can be an important step in the developmental editing process. It will give you a feel for the editor's energy and tone and process. It will help you intuitively know if you can trust yourself in your writing with this particular stranger. So of course, feel free to reach out to me for a consult or to request a list of other developmental editors with whom I'm in community and would recommend. And please bring your questions in the Q&A. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Next up, I'd like to welcome Martha.
Hey everybody, I'm Martha Walters. I'm the manager of the editorial design and production, or EDP department, and a project editor, which is sometimes called a production or a manuscript editor at other presses. And here I'm going to abbreviate that to PE. And that role is to facilitate the progress of a manuscript through editing and design to a finished book. So that's represented on the bottom half of the life cycle of a book graphic, the blue portion. So the last step of the acquiring editor is launching it into EDP, and that's where the PE begins their work. So the first thing that the PE does is to take a thorough accounting of all the elements that make up the manuscript and prepare it for copy editing and design. The author or the volume editor or volume editors and the acquiring editor have done a lot of this work already through labeling elements of a manuscript with design codes, inserting figure callouts, formatting the front matter, and lots of other tasks. The PE at this point is just finalizing all of that work to make sure that someone looking at the manuscript for the first time will know exactly what each element is and how the manuscript is structured. At this stage, I might ask the designer how best to format a certain table or if a sidebar should actually be submitted as a figure. The goal is to make sure that typesetting instructions are present in the manuscript now so that the copy editor and the author can review them and make any changes before the designer begins their work. At that point, the PE will send the manuscript to a freelance copy editor to do the actual line editing, which is what most people think of when they hear the word editing. Billy will describe that process next, so I won't go into it. But I will say that the PE's role during that time is to stay in contact, answer questions from both the copy editor and the author, and then make any final calls, possibly with the help of the acquiring editor, if there are any issues raised. When copy editing is complete, the PE finalizes the manuscript for design. This is mostly a technical step to make sure that the files can work for the designer, but we also double check each element of the book, including the metadata. So that would be title, author, ISBN, of course, but we also make sure the table of contents matches the interior and that all elements we expect to be in the book are actually there and labeled properly. The designer should not have to guess what anything is or where anything goes. The designer then typesets the book and creates page proofs. As a PE at this point, I will be helping the author with whatever they need while they review their proofs. Proofreading and indexing are typically done by the author, though authors can arrange for freelancers if they'd like. I might review a draft index if the author is creating it themselves. I might help with any technical issues the author might be having with the PDF. I might send them a hard copy if they've given up on the PDF, that sort of thing. Once the proof review is complete, the PE's job is to evaluate all suggested changes for practicality, and then either make them myself or ask the designer to make them, depending on the complexity of the design. The PE will also edit and format the index for the designer. During this time, the designer will also create the cover and will send it to the PE to proof. So now that once all the corrections are made, the index is typeset, the cover is more or less ready, it becomes the time of the checklist. We review everything. Sorry, I should say the project editor, the PE, reviews everything, checking the title, author, logos, table of contents, copyright page, running heads, bios, and lots of other fiddly things that we have all listed on a always being improved check sheet. Then another editor who's never seen the project before checks all of that again. They invariably find something wrong, so we tidy that up. And then a third person who's never seen it before does the same check sheet. Hopefully at that point, we can send it to the printer. This is text and cover, goes to the printer. The printer sends us proofs of both. And then a fourth person who's never seen the project does the whole check sheet. And then the designer checks the proof as well. Finally, the project editor looks over everything one last time and lets the printer know that it's okay to move forward. At that point, the PE is done, and hopefully the author will be very happy when they get their books. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this in the Q&A.
Thank you, Martha. And finally, I'd like to welcome Billy.
Hi everyone, I am Billy Smith Hafner and I am a copy editor, the purveyor of the feared track changes, but I'm hoping that I can clarify some publishing jargon today and also maybe alleviate some fears about the copy editing process, because I think sometimes there's this misconception that it's I'm tearing up your work, or like, tearing you down in the process. But what my goal really is to like make you look good and make your book look as good as it can before it's published. So copy editing is the last edit of the book when it's in the manuscript stage, which means it's still in Word documents. It hasn't been turned into a PDF, it's not designed yet, so we can still actually really work with the text really closely. The process overall is fairly universal, regardless of what publisher you're working with. So there's going to be 3 stages of the copy edit. There's the actual copy editing, which I would do. Then there's the author review, when you get to review the copy edits that your editor has made. And then there's the cleanup phase, when all of that stuff is integrated into the Word documents and made into a final document for the press. The only variations I think that you're likely to see on the author side in this process are how much time is allotted for your review, which could be anywhere usually from 1 to 4 weeks. and whether you're interacting directly with the copy editor or if the publisher has like an intermediary figure between the two of you. So in a copy edit, my approach is sort of 1/3 grammar, 1/3 style, and 1/3 clarity. So once you've entered the sort of blue section on the chart, when you're in the EDP process, if someone says style, they probably aren't referring to your personal writing style, but to issues of like a style guide, like the Chicago Manual style, the House style, AP style, there's a bunch of different ones. These are the publisher's preferences for how the manuscript is presented in details like capitalization, number treatment, comma placement, hyphenation, super detailed things like that. So when I first receive a manuscript for copy editing, I review the style guides that are assigned for the book. And then from that, I do a set of consistency checks across the entire book, looking for the spelling of proper nouns and their capitalization, where we have commas and where we don't, and certain grammatical constructions, and other preferences that are laid out in the style guide. I don't use AI to do these checks, but I do use, the standard word find box and macros, which are little programs that you can integrate into your copy of Word that help you identify these patterns in punctuation placement and things like that. For academic books at this stage, I would also check all of your citations against all of the sources that are listed in your bibliography and make sure that those align and that we're not missing anything. After I do those checks, then I will read through your manuscript. I check for grammatical issues at this point. I'm looking for issues of clarity. So if you have maybe some jumbled phrasing from the previous round of editing, if you have a pronoun that maybe the antecedent isn't clear. And I'm also looking for matching the intention, like the author's intention with what is on the page. So like making sure then that the manuscript reads as I believe you intended it to, and sort of workshopping with you to make sure that those things match. So the goals of all of these steps are to make sure that we end up with writing that is accurate, clear, and considered. We're trying to bolster your trustworthiness with your readers and build your rapport with them so that they, so that they can take your argument at face value instead of being distracted by, typos and things like that. So after the copy editing phase, the manuscript will come to you for author review. And that's going to look like a Word document with track changes. This is when you get to review all of the recommended revisions to the book. It's also your chance to make your own corrections if you realize you've made a factual error, misstated a date, something like that. Something to be aware of, though, is that there's sort of this law of publishing that the more changes you make later in the process, the more likely it is that you're going to have more errors ending up in the final book, just because we're running out of time to catch all of those things and correct them. So at the copy editing phase, we really don't want to be adding or replacing entire passages of text or similar revisions of that scale. Then, once you've completed your review, the manuscript will go into the cleanup phase, which is again when all of those corrections are integrated into the documents proper. The copy editor will also copy edit any new material that you've added, and if there are any changes that you've rejected, if you've what we call these steps, if you've steaded any of the changes, the copy editor will usually do their best to honor those requests. There are times when it's not possible. And so the copy editor in that case would go to the press and say, hey, is it possible for us to make a compromise in this case? If the answer is no, then they will, the copy editor should reach back out to you as the author and say, sorry, we can't do it in this case. Here's why. Again, do our best to honor it, but sometimes we can't. So overall, like the hope for the copy editing process is that it's a collaboration between the author and the editor to end up with a book that is accurate, clear, and considered. We want to make the best use that we can of the author's specialized expertise in their field and the copy editor's knowledge of publishing conventions, grammar rules, and house style to make sure the book is as polished and professional as it can be before publication.
Thank you so much, Billy, and thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for sharing these insights into your areas of expertise. Um, Now I'm going to ask all of our editors to please turn on their cameras, and we'll get together and answer some of these questions that have been coming in. Let's see. I think maybe the first one that we should address, since it's relevant to what Billy was talking about just a moment ago, is can we establish the differences between the copy editing process versus proofreading?
I can answer that. Yes. So copy editing occurs again when the manuscript is in Word documents. So we can work with we can make track changes in Word documents. Proofreading, there's a lot of like colloquial, I guess, confusion between these terms because you might send an email and be like, oh, can you give this a quick proofread before I send it? Proofreading and publishing comes at the proof stage. The book has already been turned into a PDF. It's like designed, it looks like a book. So it's really difficult to make changes at that stage. And we want to try to reduce that as much as possible because like the proofreader can't make the change, the author can't make the change. We have to tell the designer, hey, you need to like change this comma or whatever. So those are the basic differences.
Awesome.
Can I add something as well? So during copy edit, because it's pre-design, the goal is obviously not to rewrite massively, but you can, like, if a paragraph needs to be reordered, you can reorder it without, too much headache. Once you get a designed book, if you start making changes of that magnitude, then you're running into repagination. It's going to affect the index that you're writing. Like proofreading really needs to be specific only to like actual errors of fact. So like changing a date or something like that, because if you mess up the design of the page, it just throws off so much.
Could I also ask Martha if you could describe the difference between the press versus the author responsibilities of copy editing and proofreading?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your
Yeah,
question. I'm
yeah.
sorry.
No, sorry.
Okay.
So that the press that we manage the copy editing process and
Oh, I
that,
see.
we
Okay.
hire, yeah.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Yeah, so we part of the press's role is part of our budget is that we hire freelance copy editors. So every book gets a copy edit paid for by University Press of Florida. Um, Proofreading is something that the author typically does themselves. If they can get subvention funding for that, they can hire someone, or if they want to pay for it themselves, they can, but that's not part of our actual budget. We go over the proofs as Emily can attest, and as I described before, we have a million people looking at it. We go over the proofs as carefully as we can, but we don't have the staff or the budget to have somebody actually read the proofs. So that would be an author responsibility.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for weighing in on that question. Um, I think next let's turn our attention. There are a lot of questions here about careers and how we got started in this industry and how we might suggest others get started in this industry. Um, would anyone like to share how they got started? Any suggestions for that?
I can quickly, just real quick. I had a job that I hated, and then there was an opening for the front desk person at UPF. And so I got the job as the receptionist. And then a position opened in EDP, like editorial assistant opened, and I sort of had a good skill set for that and got that job and then, just never left. But I think that is not necessarily the front desk aspect, but that sort of getting into publishing in whatever department has openings and then moving around within, even if it's not your preferred department. I think that holds for a lot of people. So you could start in marketing, you could move to acquisitions. There's a lot of different departments that are interesting in different ways that people might not be aware of. So I would say if there's anything open at a press you admire, you should apply for it.
Would anyone else like to tell us how you got started? in the industry?
I can answer that, I guess. Similar to Martha, I guess, I started out as an editorial assistant at a university press. And then I switched over to, we called it manuscript editing, but project editing. And so I was hiring freelance copy editors, and I eventually decided like I don't want to be doing the hiring. I'd rather just be doing the copy editing myself. So I switched gradually into just like full-time freelancing from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And there are also some questions about like tools and resources or ways to kind of get your foot in the door. Um, if we have any ideas about tips for that. Um, one place that you can look while you guys are thinking about that question, if you have any, one place that our participants can look is our next panel. We're going to be interviewing or talking with some past interns at the University Press of Florida. So internships are always a great place to get started.
Can I jump in and plug some resources?
Absolutely, please do.
If you're interested in becoming a developmental editor for academics specifically, it's these resources are relatively new. So if you've never heard about them, I would say in the last several years, I would check out manuscriptworks.com. That's Laura Portwood Stacer's site, and she offers courses there, some self-guided. She also recently put out a book a month or two ago called Make Your Manuscript Work. It's geared towards authors developmentally editing your own academic books, but you can learn about it to become a developmental editor too. And then I would also plug the courses offered by Ideas on Fire, which is ideasonfire.net. There are some others, but those are the two primary ones I would recommend.
Thank you so much for that. Um, we also have a question here. It's specific for Billy, but I'd like to open it up to everyone. What does a typical workday look like for you? So for this specific question for Billy, in copy editing, is freelancing a lifestyle choice or a way to maintain job security? But I think that I'd like to hear what everyone's job is on the day-to-day basis.
I can answer briefly since I guess it was directed at me, but freelancing is definitely not, I would say, a secure feeling job. It's I work with a bunch of different publishers, and I never know when they're going to have something available for me. But it is like it is a good lifestyle for me. Like I don't have to go into an office every day. But there is a trade-off. Like I also don't have benefits. I don't have a full salary. I don't have health insurance provided and things like that. But yeah, a lot of freedom otherwise.
I guess as a project editor, my day is mostly checklists and emails. So like there's just so much checking. We're just checking everything 80 million times and then emailing with authors and emailing with copy editors and trying to troubleshoot stuff. Um, so yeah, mostly emailing. And then usually that's all morning. And then in the afternoon, it would be actually getting down and doing the work that the emails contained. So somebody got their proofs and forgot that they meant to have a table in their book. And so how are we going to work the table in? Like that happened years ago, Stephanie, don't worry. It was before. It was not your book. But you know, that sort of thing, like dealing with the problems of the emails of the morning. But it's definitely like being a project editor is like constantly solving puzzles, which I really love.
For me, there's a lot of emails. I think probably a lot of us have days taken over by emails. I do have a good number of meetings with prospective authors, current authors, series editors, talking about projects, either projects that might be submitted to the press or projects that are in development. And then a good bit of reading. I'm always reading proposals and sample chapters. When I get reviewers, I'm reading the peer reviews and working through how I think the manuscript might need to be revised, so doing some close reading and editing of manuscripts. So that's sort of a good snapshot of my day.
Rachel or Joel, would either of you like to weigh in?
Uh, it feels like juggling lots of things. But you know, working with the series is wonderful, and I think each of us in the collective that we have for the specific series are managing different workloads outside of this. So it's kind of like an additional. We do it for passion and interest, right? And so like when it's not really directly like we're all employed at different universities, and that's the primary kind of like employment function, but then like being a series editor is like a benefit to like contribute to more broadly to like the field and the conversations that are taking place. And so it is like juggling insofar as like each of us kind of takes it on as we see fit, and as we're able to. And I think that's probably the case with lots of series editors and lots of different presses as well. So I think that's something to consider as an author working with a series editor. I think I will for our collective, we're trying to communicate as quickly as we can with folks and be as responsive as possible and turn things around as quickly as possible. But there's also so many demands on time in addition to that. Also each of us is kind of juggling several different things in that process, but it is a really lovely opportunity to think about the ways in which we can support authors and bring their voices and perspectives into the conversation, and use, because we understand the power of books and the ability to influence like conversations and debates and understanding about the human condition. And so, you know, using that time and the ability of having this series with the press is really nice in that regard. So I think there's no concrete kind of answer there. I kind of, in a way, stumbled into it. I was at the University of Florida as an assistant professor, and Stephanie and I met through a different project, which I was a contributing author to. But Stephanie and I met and we discussed that project and things like that. So we got to know each other a bit. And then I was also involved in the Conference of Latin American Geographers, which is a specific subdisciplinary group of geographers that had a book series, and they were in the process of changing over that book series. And so through coincidence and opportunity and Stephanie's willingness to take take on this idea and work with us and like really spearhead a lot of the advocacy for it, we were able to bring this together. And so that's kind of like going back to my initial comments. It was a lot. This has been a long process, at least for this specific series, but it's a really wonderful one that the folks that are all involved in are deeply committed to. And so it is just kind of like finding ways to juggle existing responsibilities and then using the opportunity as like I guess employed at a university to be able to influence some broader conversations by uplifting or creating spaces for others.
Thank you. It looks like we also have some questions about at what stages certain things happen. So one of them is, do you recommend working with a developmental editor before submitting the manuscript, or is there a certain stage that's best to look into?
Stephanie, do you want to? I can build on maybe something you say, but I feel like you might be a good holistic person, like overview person to answer this. Does that feel
Sure,
right?
yeah. I think one thing that I would flag is if and when you have the resources, because authors are responsible for hiring the developmental editor themselves. And so, you know, if you have the institutional resources, getting that feedback on the proposal and the project development, I think is amazing. Um, I tend to flag the need for developmental edit, maybe after. I'll flag it when I notice it, but I think most frequently I flagged it after peer review, the first round of peer review, when I see that the feedback the author has gotten, and I feel like there needs to be a lot more work than I think that I can help the author with, or that the author is able to do solely on their own. So that might be when I recommend a developmental editor. But I think it can happen at various points in the process, depending on resources, depending on how you're feeling about how your project is shaping up.
And I can add too, I absolutely agree with Stephanie, and thank you for bringing up the issue of resources. And it's so personal, but I guess where you might sort of sit with yourself about when to bring a developmental editor in is, at what point do you feel that sort of stickiness or stalling in your project? Have you been sort of sitting with something for a long time and you're like, oh my God, like, is this ever going to happen? Maybe the 10-year timeline is clicking, maybe ticking. Maybe you are really going up for promotion. Maybe you're just ready to get a project off your desk and you're just feeling stuck. That stuckness can be a good sign to bring in a developmental editor. But at the same time, if you have other support, right? Like maybe you're able to do workshops with experts in your field. Maybe you have funding from your department, for example, to, you know, bring in, fellow senior scholars in your field that then can give you feedback, and you want to hold off on spending your money until, as Stephanie says, you get to the point of getting those peer reviews. That's great. If you had abundant resources, you could do it at both stages, right? But that's often not the case. But yeah, my 2 cents.
Thank you. I think we only have time for one or two more questions. So I'll start with, do most university presses use in-house designers, indexers, copy editors, or do they keep a bank of freelancers? Because I see we have both varieties in our panelists today.
Um, to my knowledge, but Billy, correct me if I'm wrong, most UPs use freelance copy editors pretty much exclusively. Um, yeah, designers, I see a mix. Florida has an in-house designer, which I love. But we occasionally hire freelancers if if we have a workload crunch. I think there are some presses that only hire freelancers. I think that's sort of more varied across the board.
Okay, and then we also had a question about what softwares or computer programs are commonly used in the editorial department.
Well, I guess anybody could answer that because we're all editors, right? In the manuscript phase, it's all Word. But we use, various like Billy said, various macros, either homegrown or purchased to sort of they're basically like souped up search and replaces. Um, and then once the book is typeset, it'll go out in a PDF. If I can make corrections to it, I'll be using Adobe InCopy, which is a way so the designer can prepare the InDesign file in such a way that I can access it through InCopy. So I can make changes to the text, but I'm not allowed to touch the actual design or the images or anything. I can't like massively screw things up. It's just sort of like a portal into the file. Um, and then you do stuff with the EPUBs and whatnot. So that's pretty much it for EDP that I can think of.
Yeah, I use what is it, Thorium for EPUBs often. Thorium, that's what it's called. And then I also just run it through a bunch of different e-readers and see if some of them throw issues that others don't. I also use Ace by Daisy to check for some kind of surface level accessibility concerns. We have to do much more thorough work than you can just by plugging it into Ace by Daisy, but it helps. Um, Anyone else have any other software that you use in your departments? I think this might be the last question we have time for.
This is not a software, but I find it exceedingly helpful because I do not have access to a university or institutional library. And yet I'm also dealing with folks who we're trying to figure out where they fit within their literature. So I pay for a subscription to perlego.com, which has a lot of academic books available. Maybe not helpful for the person asking the question, but I find it really helpful for someone who used to have that access and really from a really, privileged place of being internal institutionally. Just being able to double check certain things that authors are saying and make sure the secondary literature is aligned with what I'm hearing from them. Yeah.
Thank you. And we are about out of time. Is there anything anyone would like to add before we wrap up? In that case, I'd like to thank everyone so much for participating and for answering all of these questions and telling us about the different roles that you take. And to our attendees, if you have any questions that were not addressed during this panel, please reach out to our panelists. There's contact information on the screen here. It's also posted to the chat, I think, or it will be. This contact information will also be provided in an email to all webinar registrants next week. So if you don't get it now, you will later. A recording of the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel, which is Florida Press. A link to the recording will also be sent next week to all webinar registrants. The next panel in our symposium, Careers in Publishing, takes place at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, followed by a networking session geared towards students interested in publishing careers, and that'll be at 4 p.m. Eastern. If you're interested in attending either of these sessions, please click on the link, which will be coming up in the chat here in a minute, to register. On behalf of University Press of Florida and today's panelists, thank you so much for attending.